now that we have the rule, what is in it? What does it say? And the most efficient way to do that is to try to create a table very quickly of sort of the high level pieces that you need to know. This is not comprehensive. You need to read sections 170.1 through 170.24 on your own. That's the last 70-ish pages of the rule. The first 150 pages or so, you already know what it says because we just walked through it with those three concepts. So here you have the idea of some people will be able to do self-assessment if you're at level 1 or possibly a small number at level 2. And everybody else at level 2 and level 3 will need an external third party to conduct what's called a certification assessment. So
Jacob, before you jump into that, just to hit on that self-assessment situation, we have a question. Do you have any insight into how program managers will determine what type of CU is suitable for self-assessment versus C3PAO? And if you look at the numbers of companies that the DoD estimates is 4,000 for self-assessment and 72,000 for third-party assessment. So it's obviously going to be a very small number. How do you think the DoD is going to make that determination?
I think if you're downstream from any type of weapon system program whatsoever, if you're not in some sort of obscure, non-traditional technical DoD contracting world, the chances of you actually getting a self-assessment are essentially zero. Either because of human behavior issues, cultural issues, training issues inside the DoD, or those same issues within the prime contractors that you're probably downstream from. On top of that, the prime contractors are going to be highly motivated to mitigate their own risk by high watermarking the minimum requirement for people who they send data down to. So the chances of you through the various data flows and the various contracts that you work from the various companies, and then downstream from various PMs, of them all agreeing that you need to have a level 2 self-assessment. Could it happen? Maybe. Should that probably be your most likely situation on your threat model for what you decide to do to prepare? I would not advise that at all. So just very quickly at the top here, it is an option, maybe. So we're going to cover it, but it's probably not very likely. Okay, so at each one of these levels of assessment, whether it's a self-assessment or an external assessment, you're going to have some number of requirements that are documented either in the FAR clause or in a NIST document that's prescribed. And the assessment is going to try to verify that those requirements are implemented. Now, if anybody's familiar with the 2020 rule and the fallout since of the DoD assessment methodology scoring system, or what is commonly referred to as an SPRS score, people had to self-assess their implementation, calculate a score, and then submit that score to SPRS. The CMMC rule now adopts that same process for reporting the scores of assessments done under the banner of CMMC, with the exception of level 1, where all the requirements must be fully implemented. Fully implemented requirements is a term that has meaning. And when a control that we talked about, or when one of these requirements is fully implemented, it's worth a certain number of points that can vary between level 2 and level 3. Now, this is why I said it's very important to know that 800.171a and 172a exists, because a control, a requirement, is only fully implemented if all of its corresponding verification procedures in 171 or 172a are fully met, if they are all the questions that correspond to that requirement are satisfied completely. If in the situation you are able to answer all of those questions sufficiently under CMMC, all the objectives would have a met designation. You have no open items as a result, and that results in what they call a final self-assessment or a final certification assessment, depending on who's doing the assessment, right? Okay, now everyone's very excited that POAMs, plans of action and milestones, are a feature in CMMC 2.0. But there's a lot of caveats, and this is why you need to read the rule. You need to read the specific sections footnoted here on this slide. For POAMs, it is 170.21, because yes, you can have a POAM, except only certain controls can be on that POAM, and no 5 or 3-point controls can be on the POAM. And your overall implementation rate has to be above 80%. And you can't have any of the hard-coded controls in that section on your POAM, no matter what. And there's a couple of exceptions there where they can partially be. There's a lot of got yous. But if somehow you're able to thread the needle and you are able to have a POAM, then you have a conditional self-assessment or a conditional certification, and you have a maximum of 180 days to close it with a follow-up assessment. That means if you have a third party that's doing your assessment and you have a POAM, the third party needs to come back and do an assessment to close those POAM items. Okay, so I'm going to take a break and take a breath here. This process outlined in the rule in those sections, 170.16 through 170.18, that's where the rule mentions that you need to verify that if you're using cloud service offerings to store, process, or transmit your data, it needs to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And if you've been paying attention to the news, oh boy, the DoD came out and finally clarified what they think equivalent means, or what they say equivalent means. You got any thoughts on that, Scott?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The DoD released this, this FedRAMP equivalency memo. What was it? Late December. Anyway, it came out in late December. However, this rule that we're looking at right now disagrees with what's in the FedRAMP equivalency memo, right? Well, this rule was written back in the summertime and submitted to OMB. So over the last 6-ish months, I believe that the DoD's perception or DoD's stance on FedRAMP moderate equivalency has changed significantly based on what we see in that FedRAMP equivalency memo. So now, instead of having, the SSP and a few other documentation, pieces of documentation that you need to be able to prove FedRAMP equivalency, which is what it says in the rule, now effectively DoD has killed FedRAMP equivalency with that FedRAMP equivalency memo. And I think that is signaling what we're expecting to see in 2024 when DFAR 7012 gets revised. I believe, this is my personal opinion, I believe that we're going to see that wording completely removed from DFAR 7012. So there will be no more equivalency in the 7012 clause. So effectively, equivalency is dealt. What does that mean? That means that essentially any CSP or cloud service offering that you leverage has to be FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high, period, end of story. That's essentially where we're headed. At least that's what it looks like where we're headed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I would share that same reading of the tea leaves. I feel like obviously something significant happened in DoD's interpretation, because they basically didn't define equivalency at all since 2016, and then they woke up one day and said, when we meant equivalent, we meant the literal definition of the same. So there's a lot to unpack in that memo. I would say I saw a question in chat here where somebody said, which one do you think will take priority? At a minimum, if they keep the concept of equivalence, which they may not, I would say that the memo is almost certainly going to take precedence, just like Scott said, because the memo is the newest interpretation. Okay. Yeah. So to continue on here, how often are these going to occur? Well, for level 1, it occurs annually. For everybody else, it occurs triennially. I got lit up whenever we did the announcement of the CMMC 2.0 video, because they said triannually, and smarty pants, those of us will know triannually and triennially technically mean different things. So I was like, well, they're going to do it 3 times a year. Triennially means every 3 years. Every 3 years. Please, DoD, if you're watching, just change it to say every 3 years. I know the lawyers like triennially. Nobody else likes it. So these assessments are going to occur every 3 years. Either a self-assessment for the 1 or 2 of you who can do that, or an external assessment either by DoD themselves at level 3 or by a C3 PAO as the third party at level 2. Now,
so talk a little bit about what it takes to get a level 3 assessment, because you can't just go out and get a level 3 assessment. What do you have to have before that? I mean,
yeah. So the big fun asterisk at the top up here with level 3 for the first footnote down there is that in order to get your level 3 assessment, you need to have a CMMC level 2 final certification assessment. Final meaning no open items. Oh yeah, and when DIBCAC shows up to do your level 3, they can always check to see if they're curious if your level 2 controls are still implemented, and if they fall out of compliance, no more level 3 for you. So they have gotten away from really hammering the concept of maturity, and they're basically just saying it's a prerequisite, right? You have to have this in order to have that, and if you don't have level 2, you don't get level 3. They've just sort of ditched the maturity rhetoric around the program here. One of the interesting things about the rule is the inclusion of affirmations. Annual affirmations by senior company officials that you are attesting officially, documented, as a senior representative of the company in SPRS every year and after every assessment, whether you conduct it or somebody else conducts it, that you are pinky promising that you are complying with the requirements that you bid on when you got the solicitation that had the provision in it, that had the contract clause that you accepted, that you had a self-assessment for, that you just did a new self-assessment for. Like, there's half a dozen things now that say you're getting the requirements are coming, you've agreed to implement them, you're promising that you implemented them, we're sending people to check that you've implemented them. This isn't 2013 anymore. This isn't some random phantom clause that is buried somewhere. I mean, there's like 6 of these things now.
And there's only one reason that this is in there. One reason and one reason only, in my opinion, is False Claims Act.